Jalen Pierce was the only black teacher at Oxford Prep. The students loved him. His math scores broke records. But one email mocking his credentials was sent by the school's most beloved white instructor, Carlisle Whitmore, and no one spoke up. Days later, Jalen's salary was frozen, his classes reassigned, and a musical mocking him was greenlit by the board. But what they didn't know, he was quietly building a spreadsheet, and it was about to expose them all. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Jalen Pierce stood outside the towering iron gates of Oxford Preparatory Academy, the morning mist curling around his polished shoes like cautious whispers. The building ahead gleamed with generational wealth, ivy crawling up stone walls that had seen decades of privilege and policy. He adjusted the navy blue knot of his tie, eyes scanning the courtyard where clusters of students strolled in blazers, stitched with family legacy. It wasn't just a new job, it was a battlefield with chandeliers. Oxford wasn't built for people like him, not originally. And though times had changed on paper, the culture underneath remained marinated in coded politeness and masked superiority. He knew this, and yet his heart still thudded with a quiet hope. Jalen wasn't just a teacher, he was a legacy breaker, a mathematician molded from generations of brilliance and burden, stepping into a school that taught sonatas but rarely taught struggle. As he crossed the grand courtyard, every step felt like a challenge. The marble steps leading into the building echoed louder beneath his feet than they had for any other teacher that day. He greeted the receptionist with a warm smile. Jalen Pierce. First day, math department. Her eyes scanned the list. Smile mechanical. Oh, you're the new numbers guy. Room 2. That pause. That almost imperceptible hesitation. Jalen caught it. The first crack in a polished frame. He nodded and walked toward the staff wing, where portraits of former headmasters, all white, all male, watched him with silent judgment. In the faculty lounge, voices hushed slightly when he entered. He didn't imagine it. People turned back to their coffee quickly, like a reflex. A few offered nods, and a balding man in a fleece vest gave a passing welcome aboard. But no one asked him where he was from, what he taught, or what brought him to Oxford. The unspoken answer, it seemed, was already assumed. Then came the entrance of Mr. Carlisle Whitmore. The hallway practically shifted when Carlisle walked through. He was the type of man who wore classical music like armor suits, with subtle gold embroidery, cufflinks shaped like treble cleves, a walking cane not for necessity but for performance. Students called him Maestro, and faculty referred to him as the heart of Oxford's artistic legacy. "Ah," Carlisle said, approaching Jalen with the grace of a seasoned actor. "You must be our new numerical navigator." Jalen extended a hand. Jalen Pierce, math teacher. Carlisle shook it, smiling wide but with eyes that never quite softened. Carlisle Whitmore, music, 25 years here and still counting. Or should I say composing. Polite chuckles followed from nearby faculty. Jalen smiled through it, but he felt its subtle, syrupy condescension, layered under charm. "Nice to meet you," he said simply. As Carlisle turned away, he called back over his shoulder, "Hope you don't mind the echo of Beethoven through the vents. Our building loves acoustics." Jalen's first class of the day was with the freshman advanced track. The students were bright-eyed, curious, and surprisingly open. He introduced a mathematical problem using real-world logic puzzles and urban design scenarios. By the end of class, even the quiet students were leaning in. When the bell rang, a few lingered behind. "Math actually made sense today," one student muttered on the way out. It was the first real smile Jalen had cracked all day. By lunchtime, word had already spread that the new math guy was different. Some students seemed energized, others wary. Teachers, however, remained largely distant. Jalen sat alone in the faculty lounge, eating quietly. A few tables over, Carlisle held court with an espresso in hand, and a laugh that echoed too perfectly. Every few seconds, someone glanced at Jalen, then quickly looked away. That evening, back in his small office, Jalen checked his email. The inbox had routine welcome messages, school calendar links, and a forwarded message titled LOL New Staff Edition. It was from Carlisle, sent to the internal faculty list. It read, "Math teacher's a bright young lad, full of energy, like a jazz musician with a calculator. Let's hope he doesn't turn the curriculum into a hip-hop cipher. Quantitative credentials these days come with rhythm, I guess." There was laughter in the responses. Small smiley faces. From a department head. Jalen stared at the screen. His chest tightened, not from shock but from recognition. This wasn't new. This was tradition with a fresh coat of elitism. He didn't reply. He simply forwarded it to his personal email and saved a PDF copy in a folder titled Documentation. Carlisle smiles to Jalen's face, but later sends a private faculty-wide message mocking his quantitative credentials. The next morning at Oxford Preparatory Academy arrived with an eerie stillness that clung to the walls like condensation. Though the corridors echoed with the usual early chatter of students and staff, a quiet undertow had begun swirling beneath the surface. Jalen Pierce felt it the moment he stepped into the faculty lounge. The glances weren't long, but they were pointed. The smiles were forced, more strained than friendly. Something had changed overnight, and it wasn't in the curriculum. Carlisle Whitmore's email had begun circulating beyond the original recipients, first through accidental forwards, then through screenshots, and finally, through hushed conversations. What began as a self-congratulatory joke, laced with subtle degradation, had become a subtle fault line among the faculty. The original message wasn't complex. It was brief, casual, and camouflaged under wit. Math teacher's a bright young lad, full of energy, like a jazz musician with a calculator. Let's hope he doesn't turn the curriculum into a hip-hop cipher. Quantitative credentials these days come with rhythm, I guess. What followed was worse than the content. It was the reaction. Faculty replies included laughing emojis, musical puns, and approving reactions that disguised themselves as collegial banter. Not a single voice questioned the email's tone or implication, not one. Jalen sat silently in the corner of the lounge, as this truth hardened inside him. No one brought it up. No one apologized. No one looked him in the eye. And yet, the room pulsed with unspoken awareness. The laughter had changed pitch. It wasn't just about humor anymore. It was about power, who held it, who used it, and who felt safe enough to ignore its abuse. A few teachers leaned in closer to one another than usual, whispering behind half-raised coffee mugs. Others left the lounge early, pretending to be pressed for time. One younger teacher, Ms. Renly from the English department, glanced toward Jalen with something unreadable in her eyes. Pity, perhaps. Or shame. She didn't speak to him, but 10 minutes later, Jalen's inbox pinged with a new message. It was the same email. Forward to him anonymously. No subject line. No sender signature. Just a clean thread. He stared at it for several minutes. There were no racial slurs. No explicit violations. Just a symphony of undermining implications. The kind that played in the background of institutional culture. Never loud enough to be punished. Always quiet enough to be defended. The use of jazz and hip-hop weren't accidental. They were metaphors soaked in cultural stereotyping. Math was being subtly stripped of its rigor, simply because of the man teaching it. The message wasn't about music. It was about what kind of blackness was acceptable, and what kind wasn't. Jalen didn't respond. He didn't delete it, either. Instead, he printed it on Oxford letterhead. He folded it neatly, and placed it in a plain manila envelope, sliding it into his leather briefcase with practiced calm. As he did, his fingers brushed against something else in the side compartment. A sealed envelope, yellowing slightly at the edges. He had seen it a dozen times, and ignored it just as many. It was from his father. Jalen had received a letter 6 months ago, 2 weeks after the funeral. It had arrived late, delayed by address changes and mail forwarding errors. He'd never opened it. Somehow, part of him felt like opening the envelope would make his father's absence more permanent. But now, the letter sat beside the printed email, a relic of the past, next to a trigger of the present. 2 stories about black intellect being challenged. 2 generations trying to survive the same war dressed in different uniforms. Throughout the day, the faculty divide grew sharper, though never openly discussed. Some teachers maintained polite distance from Jalen, as if his very presence made them complicit. Others avoided him completely. In the afternoon, an impromptu meeting was scheduled by the department head, under the guise of team building. Jalen attended. Carlisle did not. The meeting felt hollow. No one mentioned the email, yet everyone seemed to orbit around its impact. Vague comments about communication tone and collegial respect danced around the real issue. Jalen watched it all unfold with a quiet intensity, every word fueling the inner ledger he was keeping, not just of names but of silences. It wasn't just who said the wrong thing, it was who said nothing at all. That night, he walked through Oxford's library, rows of books, watching him, like a jury. He found a seat by the window and opened his laptop, clicking through faculty bios, reading departmental history, analyzing administrative patterns. The math was already forming patterns in his mind. He wasn't sure yet what to do with them, but something told him this wasn't an isolated event. There was a larger algorithm of exclusion operating in these halls. An unexpected moment came at dusk. As the janitorial staff moved through the building, an older custodian passed Jalen's table. He paused briefly, offering a nod. It wasn't the gesture of a stranger. It was one of recognition. A silent salute between men who had seen similar battles. The man moved on without saying a word, but the moment lingered. Outside, the courtyard was empty. The day had ended, but its weight remained suspended in the air, like humidity. Back in his apartment, Jalen placed the printed email beside the unopened letter again. His eyes lingered on the handwriting, his father's loops and angles still intact through the envelope. The man had once been a tenured professor at a southern university, before being forced into early retirement for calling out racial bias in grant distributions. The echoes were too loud to ignore. He considered, just briefly, what Carlisle's email would have looked like back then. More blatant, perhaps. Less rehearsed. But the damage, likely the same. The next morning would bring more meetings, more performance smiles, and more sidelong glances. Jalen knew it. But what no one else at Oxford knew, not yet, was that a line had already been drawn. Not by a response, but by a record. He had started documenting. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Jalen quietly prints the email and tucks it into his briefcase, next to an unopened letter from his late father. The following weeks at Oxford Preparatory moved with the illusion of normalcy. But beneath it, currents were shifting. Jalen's classroom, room 2014, quickly became something of an academic anomaly. His unorthodox teaching methods, integrating real-world logic puzzles, urban analytics, and even architecture into equations, began transforming how students engaged with math. Students who once slouched in their seats now leaned forward. Laughter had started replacing confusion. Problem sets were returned with fewer blank spaces. Even those who had internalized that math wasn't their thing were now scribbling enthusiastically, lingering after class with questions and ideas. There was a quiet electricity in his room, a momentum building on its own merit. Word got around. Parents began emailing the department, curious about what was happening in Mr. Pierce's class that hadn't happened in previous years. The administration noticed a spike in test performance among his students. Some even asked to transfer into his section, citing that he makes the numbers speak to us. Jalen never bragged. He simply prepared more, poured more, stayed later. But not everyone watched with admiration. Carlisle Whitmore, who had long enjoyed unchallenged reverence in Oxford's artistic wing, began to bristle in silence. At first it was invisible, a longer than necessary glance through the faculty lounge window as Jalen walked by, or a sudden quiet when Jalen entered a conversation. But soon it turned into something more calculated. The first incident came during a monthly department mixer. Faculty and parents mingled over hors d'oeuvres, discussing student progress and curriculum goals. Jalen, dressed sharply and standing beside the head of the science department, was pulled into a discussion by a cluster of eager parents who had heard glowing things about his methods. Before he could speak, Carlisle, standing nearby with his customary glass of red wine, interjected with feigned humility. With a charming laugh, he remarked how wonderful it was that Oxford's new math instructor had embraced interdisciplinary inspiration. Nodding toward his own music curriculum, he casually explained to the group how he and Jalen had brainstormed over coffee a few weeks back, and that some of the real-world math applications being used were actually part of a musical theory logic project he had been developing for years. Jalen stood still. There had been no such brainstorming, no shared coffee, no inspiration drawn. But Carlisle's performance was flawless, confident, warm, dripping in credibility. The parents nodded appreciatively. One even clapped him on the back. Jalen said nothing. His silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. He knew that correcting Carlisle in that setting would cast him as defensive or territorial. Worse, it could play into the very stereotype Carlisle subtly projected, that Jalen was only successful through borrowed brilliance. But the tension seeped deeper after that night. The following week, Carlisle uploaded a new interdisciplinary unit onto the faculty sharing portal, one that eerily mirrored Jalen's most recent class structure, but framed it through the lens of musical pattern recognition. It was dated and titled before Jalen's own materials were archived. It wasn't just mimicry. It was positioning. Preemption. Jalen watched as teachers congratulated Carlisle on breaking new ground. A few even reached out to ask if Jalen had seen the new unit, as it seemed right up his alley. He smiled politely, responding with a tight nod. He began documenting again. Each incident added to the growing digital trail. Emails, screenshots, date stamps. But still, he said nothing publicly. Not because he was unsure, but because he was watching, measuring the ecosystem. Every misstep Carlisle made without being checked was a line added to the equation. Jalen was solving, a pattern was emerging, and he needed the full picture. But the emotional cost was increasing. There were mornings when Jalen sat in his car outside the school building longer than he meant to, gripping the steering wheel as if bracing for impact. There were nights when he reviewed his lesson plans with a hollow stomach, wondering what parts of his brilliance might be stolen next, and who might believe the theft. Despite this, he poured himself even deeper into the classroom. One lesson involved using statistical modeling to analyze music trends and predict streaming algorithms. Students were fascinated. Another project had them building mathematical models for designing their dream cities, connecting architecture, zoning, and equity into geometry. His room became a living lab of engagement. He saw it in their eyes. His students were waking up to a world where math wasn't abstract punishment, but power. A language. A lens. A tool. That power, however, made him a threat. Unbeknownst to Jalen, Carlisle had spoken to the assistant principal about coordinating classroom evaluations, specifically requesting to observe the dynamics of interdisciplinary influence. The request seemed benign, even cooperative, on paper, but its purpose was clear: surveillance disguised as mentorship. The unexpected twist came days later during parent-teacher night. As Jalen prepared his student feedback sheets and organized his display board of projects, he overheard a conversation just beyond the library doors. Carlisle stood chatting with a group of parents, smiling broadly, discussing how the arts had long been undervalued in academia, and how the math department's new approach had taken inspiration from his work with rhythm structures. Jalen froze. A familiar parent, the mother of one of his brightest students, glanced toward him mid-conversation, visibly confused. Carlisle quickly pivoted the topic. That night, Jalen went home and opened his father's letter. Inside was a single sheet, handwritten in clean, looping penmanship. His father spoke not of anger, but of resilience. He described the fatigue of being a black academic in predominantly white institutions. How subtle erasures could wound more than overt attacks. He urged Jalen to document everything, not out of paranoia, but out of preparation. They will challenge your presence, then claim your voice. The letter read. Let the data defend you when your silence can't. The words ignited something deeper in Jalen. Not vengeance, but clarity. And so he revised his classroom evaluations file. Not only his own notes, but logs of incidents, who said what, when, and how it affected curriculum control. He began cross-referencing digital timestamps with lesson plans, tracking the pattern of appropriation. The line between inspiration and theft had been crossed. Repeatedly. Then came the day. Midweek, the school moved into its standard round of unannounced classroom observations. A routine evaluation window all teachers expected. But what wasn't expected was who walked in during Jalen's second period class. Carlisle, clipboard in hand. No evaluator from the academic board. No department chair. Just him. He strolled into the room with exaggerated calm, offering a brief nod and taking a seat near the back. Students turned, momentarily distracted. Jalen continued the lesson, heart steady but alert. He knew what this was. An ambush disguised as oversight. Carlisle's smirk never faltered. The clipboard hid his intentions. But Jalen saw through the performance. He didn't stop the lesson. He elevated it. And as he layered historical inequities into algorithmic problem-solving, drawing connections between redlining and statistical discrimination, the students leaned in, not just with curiosity, but with urgency. Carlisle scribbled notes. During an evaluation, Carlisle walks into Jalen's class unannounced, clipboard in hand, smirking. The evaluation day passed without a word. No follow-up email, no official remarks, just silence. The kind that hums with anticipation before a storm. Jalen kept his head down, but his instincts stayed sharp. He sensed Carlisle was not finished. He was only rehearsing. What came next was not academic. It was theatrical. Carlisle Whitmore had always fancied himself more than a teacher. To him, Oxford was his stage, and he its maestro. That persona, eccentric, magnetic, immune to critique, had protected him for decades, and now with Jalen's rising influence unsettling that comfort. Carlyle did what all performers do when threatened. He curated a spectacle. The first signs were subtle. Snippets of lyrics pinned to the staff bulletin board, scrawled in elegant handwriting. Phrases like, "When numbers fail, the rhythm reigns," or "Logic has limits, but melody has soul." Harmless at first glance. Clever. Even, but the subtext was sharp and deliberate. Then came rehearsals. Students from the advanced music ensemble were seen carting props into the auditorium. Jazz chords spilled into the hallway during lunch breaks. Faculty emails buzzed with invitations to an original student staff production, directed by Mr. Carlyle Whitmore. The title remained undisclosed for several days, creating an air of mystery. Jalen didn't need to know the name. He could feel what was coming. His suspicions were confirmed when a sophomore, sheepish and quiet, left behind a notebook in his class. Scribbled on the back page was a script outline labeled, "The Rhythm versus the Ruler." The characters included a stiff, rule-obsessed math tyrant who sucks the joy out of learning, and a musical rebel who liberates the students with sound. Jalen flipped the page. Scene 1 opened with a classroom parody that mirrored his own lesson structure. Rigid formulas, no music, no joy. Scene 2 introduced the hero, a charming music teacher who breaks into a rap against boring equations. It was more than satire. It was a coded attack, and it had institutional backing. By the end of that week, flyers appeared across campus. Colorful, glossy, and stamped with Oxford's crest, they announced the approved premiere of The Rhythm versus the Ruler. The board had greenlit Carlyle's performance for the semester showcase. Some students cheered, others whispered. The flyer was handed to Jalen by one of his own students, a girl who looked apologetic before she spoke. He didn't react, just accepted the paper and returned to grading. But inside, the weight of it settled deep. Carlyle wasn't just stealing influence. He was weaponizing culture against credibility. He had turned Oxford's stage into a battlefield, disguising racism as creativity, shielding discrimination with applause. The division among students quickly became visible. Jalen's math classes remained full, but the air had changed. A few students leaned back in their chairs with smirks they hadn't worn before. Some asked sarcastic questions, challenging theories with empty logic. One even muttered, under his breath, "What's the formula for rhythm again?" At lunch, it became worse. Jalen sat alone at the far end of the faculty lounge, his usual spot near the window. A group of students passed his table, laughing. One of them, someone he'd previously mentored, tossed a crumpled sheet of paper onto his tray. Jalen unfolded it slowly. It was a printed music score. Scribbled across it in red ink were 5 words, "Math ain't music, sir." He didn't flinch. He folded it neatly and placed it in the same folder that now contained Carlyle's email. The script outline, and every small slight documented since day 1. Each piece was becoming a brick in a foundation of truth, one he would eventually use to expose the performance behind the performer. Later that day, Jalen stood in the back of the auditorium as rehearsals ran. Carlyle, in the center aisle, conducted the students like an emperor orchestrating his legacy. The scenes were exaggerated, cartoonish versions of classroom dynamics. One actor wore thick glasses and walked stiffly while barking mathematical gibberish. The audience, mostly students involved in the arts, roared with laughter. No one noticed Jalen watching. He walked out before the final act. The laughter echoing behind him felt less like joy, more like betrayal. An unexpected moment came that evening. Jalen found an envelope slipped under his classroom door. Inside was a note. "I know what he's doing, and I don't agree. Stay strong. Some of us see it." No name. No return address. Just 7 sentences typed in 12-point font. But it was enough to confirm what he suspected. Carlyle's act wasn't universally adored. Cracks were forming. Some faculty saw through the theatrics. Some students did too. Still, the damage was spreading faster than resistance. That week, a parent emailed Jalen with concern, not about math but about his tone in the classroom. She'd heard from her son that Jalen dismissed the arts, that he taught with rigidity, and didn't encourage expression. None of it was true. But perception, once tainted, was difficult to cleanse. He crafted a careful, professional reply. Data-backed, courteous, unemotional, but in private he added the exchange to his growing log. Each new day brought a new insult, never direct, always wrapped in plausible deniability. Carlyle knew how to play this game. The performance wasn't just on stage, It was in the staff meetings, in the curriculum overlap, in the way he dominated parent conversations with that disarming smile and polished charm. Jalen began preparing his own counter-performance. Not one of music or drama, but of numbers, timelines, and policy. He started compiling course materials, timestamps, enrollment data, student feedback, and digital metadata from the school's internal portals. He traced the dates of his curriculum uploads against the creation of Carlisle's so-called interdisciplinary project. The evidence was damning, but he remained quiet, because he wasn't building a defense. He was building a case. The real twist came days before the premiere. The administration announced, via school-wide email, that the Rhythm versus the Ruler would be performed not just as an arts showcase, but as a faculty-student collaboration project to highlight interdisciplinary unity. Teachers from across departments were invited to attend. Attendance was highly encouraged. Jalen sat at his desk, hands folded, as the final bell rang. He looked at the flyer again. The title glared at him in bold red, The Rhythm versus the Ruler, an original musical by Carlisle Whitmore. Approved by Oxford's school board. Jalen is handed a flyer. The school board has approved Carlisle's performance, and it's titled The Rhythm versus the Ruler. The flyer sat on Jalen's kitchen counter for 2 full days, untouched but not unnoticed. Its glossy finish caught the sunlight through the blinds each morning, casting the bold title, The Rhythm versus the Ruler, across the hardwood floor like a scar. Each time he walked past it, something inside him tightened, as if it were daring him to do nothing. The silence had become heavier. Oxford no longer felt like a school. It felt like a theater where every day he was forced to perform restraint. But it wasn't just restraint, it was survival, and that made it worse. By Friday evening, the pressure had carved itself into his routine. He made tea, turned on the dim light above the dining table, and pulled open the drawer he had avoided for months. Inside sat the envelope, aged, soft-edged, addressed in familiar handwriting that he hadn't seen since the funeral. It was time. He sliced it open with slow precision, careful not to tear the paper inside. His father's script still held its form, neat loops and angles, measured yet expressive. The words poured out like a whisper from the past, not accusatory, not urgent, just honest and raw. His father, Dr. Jalen Pierce, had been a tenured math professor at a southern state college in the 90s. He wrote about the pressure of wearing suits just to be taken seriously, the coded remarks from white colleagues who called him eloquent, and the students who questioned his credentials simply because he was black. He described the exhaustion, not just physical but spiritual, of having to prove himself every single day, in every lecture, in every faculty meeting, while smiling through it. What struck Jalen most wasn't the pain. It was the clarity. His father warned that the system would never come at you with slurs anymore. It would come with smiles, committees, performance evaluations, and creative projects. It would never scream, it would hum, and the only way to fight a humming machine was with numbers, patterns, proof. The second half of the letter was different. Elias had once attempted to use mathematics as a weapon against institutional racism, not through protest or publications, but through pattern analysis. He had spent years developing a complex algorithm to track administrative bias in hiring, tenure, and promotion processes. The math was there, but the era wasn't ready. The project was shelved after his early retirement, dismissed, ignored, buried under silence. But in the final lines, Elias hinted that the model might still hold power, that it could adapt, that someone smarter, younger, more fearless might finish what he started. And then, beneath the final signature, Jalen noticed something else. A single folded page, handwritten code. Dozens of equations, notations, variables. At first glance, it looked like any dense academic problem set. But as Jalen scanned it, something clicked. The structure wasn't just mathematical. It was architectural, designed not to solve a problem, but to reveal one. Jalen cleared his table and spread out the page beside his laptop. He began transcribing the equations into Python code, converting the symbols into logic statements, linking the formulas with digital tools that hadn't existed in his father's time. The original algorithm focused on faculty data, salaries, evaluations, course assignments. He modified the inputs, adding variables from Oxford teacher tenure, race, department budgets, parent complaints, and even extracurricular approval rates. The screen lit up with red. Bias scores, predictive patterns, statistical significance. It was a map, one that showed how black educators at Oxford were disproportionately sidelined in leadership, disproportionately evaluated in arts departments, and almost never selected for showcase projects unless under the umbrella of diversity programming. But one pattern stood out above the rest. Over the past 5 years, interdisciplinary performances had only been approved when spearheaded by white faculty. Proposals submitted by black faculty for similar creative showcases were either delayed, denied, or restructured under joint committees. The board's bias wasn't personal, it was systemic, predictive, and mathematically provable. The data didn't accuse Carlisle alone. It accused the entire machine. Jalen sat back in his chair, heart pounding. His father hadn't just left him a letter. He had left him a weapon, one sharpened by decades of silence, one that didn't require yelling or protest signs, just numbers, cold, undeniable truth. And now he had proof. But something else dawned on him, something unexpected. Among the documents he'd uploaded into the model was Carlisle's digital curriculum log. One entry, dated months before Jalen was even hired, included a draft titled Math Through Melody, a legacy project. On the surface, it appeared to predate any conflict, but when cross-referenced with his own classroom materials, Jalen noticed identical phrases, examples, metaphors, analogies used only in his lessons. Carlisle had backdated his work. Jalen double-checked the metadata through Oxford's internal portal. He was right. The document's edit history didn't match its posted date. Someone had manually adjusted the file properties to make it appear older than it was. It wasn't just plagiarism. It was premeditated sabotage. He clicked Save As and stored the new dataset in a separate folder labeled Pattern Proof Pierce. Then he backed it up on an encrypted drive. This was no longer just about surviving a hostile workplace. It was about exposing a pattern, one inherited from his father's time, still breathing, still infecting institutions behind the curtain of progress. And for the first time since arriving at Oxford, Jalen didn't feel isolated. He felt ancestral. His father hadn't just endured. He had fought, quietly, mathematically, with code that was never meant to win alone. It was meant to be passed on. The next day at school, Jalen walked differently. He spoke less, observed more. Behind his silence was fire. He greeted students warmly, taught as always, but underneath he was calculating every angle of the stage Carlisle had built. Because now he could see its hidden blueprint, and he was ready to dismantle it. Formula by formula, Jalen deciphers the algorithm and finds a hidden mathematical pattern predicting biased school policy. The days leading up to the musical premiere pulsed with growing tension. Yet nothing on the surface had cracked. The school hummed with its usual prestige. The clink of lunch trays in the quad, the echo of cello notes from distant practice rooms, and the click of polished shoes pacing the marbled halls. But for Jalen, every sound carried new weight. He had seen the pattern. He now understood the machine. Still, he said nothing. His silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Each lecture, each staff meeting, each seemingly mundane hallway interaction added another variable to his growing mental equation. He was waiting for the moment the system revealed itself. That moment came not from the faculty, not from the administration, but from a student. Her name was Tessa Langford. 16. Sharp-minded. Observant. Quiet but never passive. She sat in the third row of Jalen's class, always taking notes, always watching more than she let on. She was one of the few students who hadn't laughed at the growing wave of ridicule sparked by Carlisle's musical. Tessa had been assigned backstage duties for the production. On the surface, she blended in, black shirt, headset, clipboard in hand. But beneath the calm, she was unsettled. She had seen the script. She'd heard the jokes whispered during rehearsal breaks. She'd watched students mimic Jalen's speech pattern. His walk, his posture, all behind closed curtains, all under Carlisle's careless direction. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a final run-through, Carlisle paused the performance midway, displeased with a cast member's delivery of a monologue mocking the math tyrant. In frustration, he began improvising the lines himself for the actor to copy. His voice rang out across the auditorium. Some people are good at numbers, but others are born to inspire, born to lead, born to feel. Laughter, applause, even a standing ovation from a few of the drama students in the wings. Carlisle bowed sarcastically. Tessa, hiding in the lighting booth, quietly tapped the record button on her phone. She didn't plan it, it was instinct. She didn't even know what she would do with the footage until she went home, watched it twice, and felt her stomach turn. The tone, the smirks, the subtext. It wasn't just a joke. It was a degradation, cloaked in art. That night, she uploaded the clip anonymously to a student-run Instagram page titled Oxford Shadows. The caption was simple: "When inspiration sounds like condescension." The video was 54 seconds long. By morning, it had 120,000 views. By noon, it had 1 million. Jalen didn't see the video until one of his students walked into class late. Phone still lit up, eyes darting between him and the screen. Murmurs passed between desks. Several students avoided eye contact altogether. Others seemed energized, as if vindicated by what they'd watched. During lunch, the principal summoned him. No explanation. No smile. No eye contact. Just an envelope slid across the desk. It was a temporary leave of absence, citing pending administrative review. No mention of the video. No mention of Carlisle. Just a cold, bureaucratic letter, advising rest and distance during this time of community tension. The irony was brutal. He wasn't the one who spoke. He wasn't the one who mocked. He wasn't the one who disrespected a colleague in front of students. But he was the one being asked to disappear, quietly. News coverage exploded. Local outlets picked up the story by evening. The video was dissected on Twitter, discussed on Facebook, and reposted on educator blogs across the country. Support came flooding in from alumni, parents, and strangers who called it what it was: institutional racism, wrapped in performance art. Hashtags like Jing, Let Pierce Teach, and Numbers Matter Too trended overnight. But with the support came something darker. Hate mail. Emails accusing Jalen of dividing the school, of manipulating kids, of playing the race card. A few anonymous messages contained threats, subtle, but vicious. "You're not the only one who knows numbers." Oxford's board remained silent. Carlisle, however, issued a public statement. He claimed the clip was taken out of context, that it was a teachable moment in acting, not commentary, that he respected all departments and valued collaboration. The school did not discipline him. They praised his commitment to artistic expression. Jalen stayed home, not by choice, but by structure. Each day he documented reactions. He organized news clippings. He created a heat map of digital commentary, dividing the responses by tone, geography, and profession. He noticed something important. While public support grew louder, institutional voices remained cautious, too cautious. Then one night, an email arrived. No sender, no subject line, just a single sentence: "You want the real numbers? I can get you the evaluations, but they'll cost you." Attached was a secure file preview, faculty evaluation metadata, time-stamped, IP-logged, and encrypted. It was real. Jalen's breath caught. Faculty evaluations were guarded under strict internal policy. Only department heads and select board members had access to the raw feedback, particularly anything involving promotion, pay grade shifts, or curriculum complaints. If someone was offering this, it meant someone inside was watching, and more importantly, someone inside wanted out. Jalen hesitated. He knew the cost wouldn't be monetary. It would be moral. He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the reply button. Outside, the streetlight flickered as shadows shifted across the apartment wall. He didn't know who the source was, but he knew one thing: this wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't even about Carlisle. It was about every teacher who had ever been silenced by performance reviews they were never allowed to see. Every staff member told they weren't a good cultural fit. Every educator praised in public but penalized in private. The offer sat before him, blinking. An anonymous donor offers Jalen access to Oxford's hidden faculty evaluations, for a price. Jalen's decision didn't come quickly. The anonymous message offering access to Oxford's hidden faculty evaluations stayed open on his laptop screen for nearly 3 hours. He didn't respond, didn't sleep. He simply stared at the blinking cursor, weighing the ethical cost against the moral burden he already carried. By morning he replied with one word: send. The file arrived encrypted, locked behind a password that was included in a separate message. "You'll know what it is." Jalen stared at the prompt for several seconds before typing it in. Elias Knight. The screen opened like a trapdoor beneath Oxford's polished surface. 20 years of hiring records, salaries, promotion decisions, internal comments from board members, evaluation scores broken down by anonymous reviewer IDs. Racial identifiers were not official. Oxford never tracked them explicitly, but adjacent metadata made the story legible. Universities attended, interview notes, names of applicants, sometimes even scanned ID documents. Jalen began the audit. He didn't approach it with rage. He approached it like a mathematician, detached, surgical. He built a master spreadsheet, created separate tabs for hiring, promotion, salary, and evaluation comments. Then he coded each entry by name, race, department, and role. He wasn't looking for anecdotes. He was hunting patterns. And they emerged with terrifying clarity. Black faculty applicants were 42% less likely to be called for second interviews, despite having more advanced degrees on average than their white counterparts. Promotion decisions skewed dramatically by race. White teachers were promoted within 5 years on average. For black teachers, the timeline stretched to 8. And even then, most were placed into coordinator roles, instead of full department leads. The evaluation comments were the most haunting. White teachers were described with terms like innovative, trusted, visionary. Black teachers, energetic but inconsistent, good rapport, lacks depth, articulate but needs oversight. And then came the salaries. Jalen filtered the sheet for current full-time staff. Carlisle Whitmore's name sat near the top, marked as Master Faculty Arts. His salary was nearly triple Jalen's, 3 times higher. Carlisle had fewer degrees, fewer certifications, less formal classroom hours. Yet, his cultural contribution had been cited as justification for a $214,000 annual base, alongside discretionary stipends for performance productions and departmental mentorship, none of which had ever been publicly listed. Jalen stared at the number. This wasn't about rivalry anymore. It wasn't even personal. It was systemic theft of labor, voice, and potential wrapped in a structure that rewarded whiteness with reverence and black excellence with silence. He took a breath, saved the file, and began building a presentation. It was methodical, brutal, impossible to deny. He opened with hiring inequities, moved into promotion timelines, then evaluation language analytics, backed by word frequency mapping. Finally, he hit salaries, not just the raw numbers, but a graph showing performance-to-pay ratio. At the bottom of the slide was a single line of text. The formula doesn't lie. It exposes. He titled the file The Oxford Pattern: 20 Years of Inequity. But before he could decide what to do with it, the first response arrived. An email from the school board. Subject: notification of pending investigation. Unprofessional conduct. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The language was sharp. It cited growing concerns regarding faculty morale, allegations of disruptive behavior, and inappropriate engagement with sensitive institutional data. There was no mention of the viral video, no acknowledgement of his leave being reactive, not disciplinary, only a line about pending review of his future at Oxford. They weren't just sidestepping accountability. They were preparing to erase him. Jalen sat in the quiet of his apartment, the glow of the laptop screen bouncing off the hardwood floor, the taste of bitter irony thick in his throat. He had spent his entire career following the rules, believing that excellence would be its own defense. But now the numbers, the very language he'd mastered, were the reason he was being targeted. And yet, the spreadsheet wasn't the only revelation. Buried in a hidden tab within the evaluations file was a document labeled Archive 2009-2010. It contained internal notes about a past faculty member, Dr. Michelle Easton, a black science teacher, who had once led the STEM initiative. She was described as overly assertive, emotionally intense, and divisive. The notes suggested that her contract not be renewed, despite unanimous student support and exceptional performance reviews. Jalen ran a search. Dr. Easton had disappeared from Oxford's history. No mention on the website. No archived newsletters. No tribute or departure announcement. It was as if she had never existed. But someone had deleted her. And now they were coming for him. He looked down at his briefcase, still neatly packed. The folder with Carlisle's email, the music sheet, mockery, the student messages, his father's algorithm. Every piece fit. The performance wasn't just on stage. It was in the hiring office. The teacher evaluations, the salary spreadsheets, the disciplinary letters. It was all one system, engineered to applaud whiteness and penalize dissent, especially from black faculty who dared to challenge it with intellect instead of anger. The next morning, he didn't show up at school. Instead, he submitted a digital copy of the Oxford pattern to a private civil rights education attorney he'd met years ago at a conference. Alongside it, he attached the full evaluation file, the salary breakdown, and the video clip. No message, just data. Because numbers, unlike narratives, don't blink. That afternoon, another email arrived. This one from an unnamed staff member. It read only, "You're not alone. When they come for you, let them know you did the math." The school board emails Jalen. He's being called for a formal investigation into unprofessional conduct. The summons to the investigation came with no warmth, just a cold bureaucratic directive, an 8:30 a.m. appearance in boardroom C. No agenda, no mention of rights or legal counsel, just one clear message: prepare to be erased. Jalen dressed deliberately that morning, a charcoal suit, a navy blue tie, the same color he wore on his first day at Oxford. But this time his briefcase wasn't filled with lesson plans. This time it carried 20 years of buried truth. Spreadsheets, charts, evaluation logs, salary comparisons. The math didn't just speak, it roared. The boardroom was sterile, windowless. A long walnut table sat in the center, surrounded by 12 chairs occupied by Oxford's top brass, HR heads, assistant principals, and board members, all armed with practiced neutrality. Carlisle Whitmore sat off to the side, posture relaxed, smile rehearsed. He looked at Jalen as if this were a scripted play and Jalen was still a minor character, fumbling through forgotten lines. Jalen didn't return the smile. Before they could begin the formalities, he spoke, calmly, directly. "I've prepared a presentation I believe will clarify a few things." The room shifted. Control wasn't supposed to start in his hands. Still, a senior board member, Miss Tilling, gestured for him to proceed. He connected his laptop. The screen came alive. Slide 1. The Oxford pattern, quantifying 20 years of institutional bias.
Then came the graphs.
Hiring bias over time, promotion delays, evaluation language analysis, performance to pay ratios. Every slide was a blade. Every statistic sharpened by silence. Jalen walked them through it all. Systemic racial disparities buried under policy and hidden behind pleasantries. When he revealed Carlisle's salary 3 times his own, despite fewer credentials and less classroom hours, the silence in the room deepened. Carlisle finally spoke, voice smooth and dismissive. "I believe Mr. Pierce may be misinterpreting institutional decisions as personal attacks. Not everything is racial." But Jalen was ready. He clicked to the next slide. Regression models, with p-values under 0. Correlation. Hard statistical truth. HR tried to pivot. "This meeting, Mr. Pierce, is about concerns regarding your behavior. Several students have said they feel intimidated, that your classes are too political." Jalen clicked again. Student feedback lit up the screen. Dozens of anonymous quotes, praising his clarity, empathy, and innovation. Then on the next slide, feedback from students involved in Carlisle's musical. Felt pressured to laugh at jokes about Mr. Pierce. Didn't feel comfortable with the mocking tone. "This isn't politics," Jalen said quietly. "It's protection." The room fell still, and then came the twist. Miss Tilling, who had remained silent until now, slid an envelope across the table. Inside, a small handwritten note. "You're not the only one he's tried to erase." Jalen looked up, stunned. Her expression didn't change, but her silence had broken. Carlisle stood suddenly, flustered. "This is absurd. I came here in good faith. Now I'm being accused with conspiracy theories and math charts." Jalen didn't rise to his volume. "It's not a conspiracy, it's an equation, and the variables don't lie." The assistant principal finally interjected, quietly suggesting a recess. No one disagreed. Jalen packed his laptop, closed his briefcase, and stood. He hadn't just defended himself. He'd flipped the entire investigation. And as he walked out, Carlisle's eyes followed, not with confidence, but calculation. Something had shifted. Oxford's old playbook was beginning to fall apart. A board member slides Jalen a handwritten note. "You're not the only one he's tried to erase." The note from Miss Tilling remained in Jalen's hand long after he left the boardroom. Its message was brief, almost cryptic, yet it struck deeper than any policy or projection he'd analyzed so far. "You're not the only one he's tried to erase." The handwriting was clean but firm, like someone who'd waited years to finally say what needed saying. And now, Jalen needed to know who had come before him. That night he sat in front of his laptop again. No music, no distractions, only questions. He scoured Oxford's archived faculty rosters, newsletters, and award announcements dating back 2 decades. Every page was a carefully curated tapestry of legacy and whiteness, punctuated with the occasional diversity feature that felt more performative than genuine. Names appeared, disappeared, reappeared in footnotes, but one in particular stood out. Dr. Lorna Miles. The science department. Hired 207. Photo: a poised black woman in a crimson blazer, arms folded in front of a chemistry lab table. Then nothing. No retirement notice. No promotion. No farewell announcement. By 2009, her name vanished entirely from Oxford's digital presence. No exit memo. No student testimonials. Just digital erasure. Jalen's heart began to race. He opened an archived newsletter, stored as a scanned PDF from 2008. One article detailed a Science and Sound Week, a now defunct interdisciplinary initiative. The article listed Carlisle Whitmore as a contributor, and quoted him saying, "Some people think formulas can inspire minds. I believe in melody over method." Underneath, in fine print, was a list of participating faculty. Dr. Lorna Miles was mentioned last. Jalen needed more. He turned to an online public access TV archive, digging through footage from local school showcases. After hours of scrolling, he found a grainy, low-resolution video, labeled Oxford Spring Gala 2008. The frame opened on the auditorium stage, Carlisle conducting a student orchestra, then a transition skit segment. A camera panned to a mock science lab setup. A teacher played by a student mimicked a stern voice, exaggerated hand gestures, and robotic speech. In the background, the crowd laughed, including a very familiar figure. Carlisle was standing stage left, arms crossed, grinning. The parody was clear. The character wore a crimson jacket, eerily close to the photo of Dr. Miles from the faculty directory. Her speech was mocked as cold, mechanical. The punchline came when another actor, posing as the music teacher, burst in with a saxophone and shouted, "Let's add some soul to this stale experiment." The crowd roared. Jalen paused the video. His breath caught in his throat. The language, the ridicule, the structure, it mirrored everything Carlisle had orchestrated against him. Years later, the cycle wasn't just repeating, it was rehearsed. But what had happened to Dr. Miles? Jalen searched the state's public education database. After several hours of keyword filters, he found a current listing: Lorna Miles, Chemistry, Rockvale County School, New Durham, a rural school district, 3 counties away. No university ties, no publications, no conference listings. He hesitated, then he called the number. A receptionist answered, directed him to her classroom line. The voice that picked up was firm, reserved. Jalen introduced himself carefully, truthfully, cautiously, not as someone looking to reopen wounds, but as someone living inside one of her echoes. There was silence, then a deep breath. She remembered. Not just Oxford, Carlisle. The gala, the skit, the forced meetings afterward, the whispers that followed, the suddenly icy tone from the administration, and finally, the reassignment offer that came without warning. She was told her position had been consolidated. No explanation, no resistance allowed. She was gone by summer. For a moment, her voice faltered. Not from sadness, from anger. "I told myself I imagined it," she said. "I let myself believe I wasn't erased, just misplaced." Jalen told her everything. The video, the musical, the spreadsheet, the note from the board member, the pattern. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. And then she said something he didn't expect. "Do you want me to come?" Jalen paused. "To the musical," she clarified. "To the night he plans to mock you on stage, the way he did me." "Do you want me to sit in the front row? Do you want them to see what they tried to delete?" He didn't answer right away, because the weight of what she offered wasn't just theatrical. It was justice, standing upright after being bent for years. It was testimony not in a courtroom, but in the very space where the crime took place. He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "I'll be there," she said, "and I won't be quiet." After the call, Jalen sat in stillness. He stared out the window of his apartment into the night sky, stars barely visible beyond city haze. The weight he had carried no longer felt singular. There were others now. Names, stories, patterns, but more importantly, witnesses. The next day he sent one message, to Miss Tilling. It read, "She's alive, and she's coming. The ex-teacher agrees to appear at Carlisle's upcoming musical." The day after the boardroom confrontation, Oxford's walls no longer echoed with the same smug confidence. Something had shifted. Not officially, not yet, but the air felt different, colder, still, as if the halls were waiting for someone to finally say out loud what they'd all been pretending not to see.
That someone turned out to be the students.
It began with whispers. Rumors circulated that Jalen had dropped hard evidence against the administration, that Carlisle's mockery wasn't just personal. It was patterned, historical, repeated. Students talked in corners, shared screenshots, even pulled old yearbooks and found pictures of Dr. Lorna Miles. One of them held up her photo next to the 2008 parody skit. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was undeniable. Then the intercoms came alive. It happened just after third period. Instead of the usual bell, a crackle buzzed through every classroom speaker, followed by the sound of a single voice, unfamiliar, but young, clear and steady. They said math has no color, but they colored the teachers, then called it coincidence. They said silence was respect, but their laughter echoed louder than our truth. Students paused mid-step in the hallways. Teachers froze mid-lecture. The poem was spoken word, deliberate and blistering. Then another voice joined in. We measured bias with numbers, and the math did not lie. You erased his lesson plan, but not his impact. It lasted 2 minutes. Then silence. Nobody claimed responsibility, but by the end of the day, 2 more broadcasts followed, each one with sharper lines, deeper indictments. They referenced Jalen, Dr. Miles, unnamed teachers who were promoted out of the school. One poem ended with a question. If excellence isn't enough, what's left for us to become? The next morning, the protest began. Students arrived wearing black shirts with masking tape across their chests. On each strip, a handwritten number. At first it looked like a fashion trend, until someone asked what the numbers meant. One student explained, it's the percentage difference in teacher salaries between departments. Mine says 4. The messages spread like wildfire. Signs appeared taped to lockers. We did the math. Respect isn't extra credit. Diversity is not decoration. By noon, nearly half the student body was seated in the central quad, silent, organized, facing the administration building. It wasn't chaotic, it was mathematical, rowed, aligned, timed. Every 10 minutes a new voice would rise from the crowd to read a line from one of the intercom poems, then silence again. The school tried to continue business as usual. But the faculty lounge was half empty. Parents started arriving, alerted by their kids' text threads and Instagram stories. News vans parked at the gates by early afternoon. A local reporter from Channel 9 News held up a mic to a senior student who calmly said, "We're not skipping school, we're teaching it now." By 2:30 p.m. the principal addressed the crowd. It was a short impersonal speech, a request for order, a reminder about respectful conduct, and a promise to review concerns through proper channels. The students didn't move. Instead, someone stood up and held a giant poster, a printed screenshot of Carlisle's line from the viral video. Some people are good at numbers, others are born to inspire. Below it, in red marker, we can be both. Inside, Carlisle watched from the second-floor balcony, arms folded, face expressionless. His musical, The Rhythm versus the Ruler, was set to premiere in 3 days. Flyers still littered the walls, but now many of them were defaced with correction tape, replacing the title with phrases like the privileged versus the truth. That night, the school board called an emergency meeting. Jalen, still technically on administrative leave, wasn't invited, but word reached him quickly. A sympathetic staffer forwarded an internal memo. Due to unforeseen disruptions, the upcoming performance has been indefinitely postponed. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the protest's message, just a clinical delay, dressed in neutrality. But the final line of the memo wasn't neutral. Effective immediately, Oxford will undergo a restructuring of faculty roles. The phrase sent a chill through the school. Restructuring. A word with 1,000 meanings, none of them safe. Faculty wondered who it applied to. Students feared it meant retaliation. Even some board members raised concern. But Jalen read it differently. This wasn't retaliation. It was recalibration. The institution had been caught off guard, its mask removed, its patterns exposed, and now it was moving, not toward accountability, but toward preservation. Restructure meant repositioning the damage, not repairing it. It meant protecting power under the guise of progress. And yet something had already ruptured beyond repair. Oxford's illusion of harmony, carefully preserved through generations of soft-spoken discrimination, was crumbling under the sound of teenage voices and statistical truth. Inside his apartment, Jalen watched the live streams of students, sitting cross-legged in the rain, refusing to move. He saw signs with his name, with Dr. Miles's name, with quotes from the intercom poems, now turned into protest chants. But one moment hit hardest. A video showed a young girl, Tessa Langford, standing on the steps of the auditorium, holding a graph Jalen had included in his presentation. The title, Performance versus Pay, A Decade of Disparity. She looked into the camera and said, "If the data scares you, the system's broken. If the truth hurts you, you were never teaching us to be honest." The crowd erupted, and in that noise, Jalen finally felt something lift. Not vengeance, not relief, just truth, undeniable, public, multiplying. But as he leaned back, laptop still glowing, an email arrived from the school board. Subject: Notice of Restructuring Phase 1. Faculty Assignment Review. It was addressed to him. Carlisle's musical is postponed indefinitely, but the board announces a restructuring of faculty role. The boardroom felt colder than usual, even though the thermostat read 72 degrees. Jalen Pierce sat across from a polished mahogany table, his eyes fixed on the documents laid out in front of him like a quiet trap. Every word typed on that settlement offer carried weight and an invisible cost. Outside the window, the prestigious grounds of Oxford Preparatory Academy lay in pristine silence, manicured lawns masking the racial fault lines cracking beneath. Superintendent Hollis, flanked by 2 legal representatives and the PR director, cleared her throat. "Mr. Pierce, we want to thank you for your contributions to Oxford. Given recent tensions, the board believes a mutual resolution is in everyone's best interest." Jalen didn't move. His hands remained folded, resting on the briefcase that held every document, email, spreadsheet, and memory of injustice he had endured since his first day. His silence made the room itch. Hollis gestured toward the thick envelope. "We're prepared to offer you a settlement package, totaling $325,000, full benefits for 18 months, and a non-disparagement clause. In return, we ask that you resign voluntarily, effective immediately." She paused. "And we will issue a public apology on behalf of the institution, though it will not reference Mr. Carlisle Whitmore by name, or mention any specific events." That last part landed like a stone in Jalen's chest. No name, no incident, no acknowledgement. Just a hollow apology to pacify headlines. Jalen reached out and slowly lifted the envelope, feeling its weight, not in paper but in principle. "So you want me to vanish quietly, and you'll buy the silence," he said, his voice low, deliberate. The PR director shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Hollis offered a corporate smile. "It's not about silencing you, Jalen. It's about moving forward, gracefully, for everyone's sake. Oxford's legacy is delicate." That word, legacy, set off something deep inside him. He thought of the coded letter his father had written, the dusty memories of classrooms his father had been forced out of, the black educators erased by polite institutional silence. He remembered the video of Carlisle's smirk during rehearsal, the board's initial indifference, and how students once threw music sheets at his table in mockery. He thought of the offer as a tombstone, a clean burial of every scar he'd accumulated under Oxford's gleaming chandeliers. And yet, peace tempted him. No more nightly headline attacks. No more walking into classrooms where the air felt like judgment. No more threats. He could take the money, disappear, maybe teach online, maybe start fresh somewhere else where the ground wasn't poisoned. He pictured the resignation letter already half-written in his mind. But then he saw something else. In his mind's eye, Jalen pictured Amir, one of his students who once said, "You made me feel like I wasn't stupid for liking numbers." And Maya, who whispered, "I didn't think people like me could do this kind of math." He saw the hundreds of students who walked through his classroom door, carrying silent weights, finding in his presence something they'd never received from an institution like Oxford: dignity. He set the envelope back down. "I didn't come here for a graceful exit," Jalen said, standing slowly. "I came to expose something broken." Hollis' smile faltered. "Jalen, if you go forward with litigation, you'll lose more than your job. You'll be branded, blacklisted. It'll be ugly." He nodded. "It already is." Jalen reached into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh manila folder. He slid it across the table. "This is my formal response. You'll find a letter declining the settlement, and a notice of legal action under the Civil Rights Act. For the first time, the room fell into genuine silence, not the orchestrated silence of control, but the raw, unsettled quiet that follows a truth no one knows how to swallow. The PR director opened a folder and paled. Hollis reached for her glass of water, but didn't drink. No one moved. "I'll let my attorney handle all further communication," Jalen said calmly. "But I'll leave you with this." He turned, stepping toward the door, then paused. "You thought peace could be bought. But justice is never on clearance." As he exited the boardroom, he passed a janitor quietly wiping down a hallway bench. The man, old and wiry, looked up and nodded. Jalen nodded back, an unspoken understanding, shared between black men who knew how institutions behaved when no one was watching. Outside, a group of students waited, whispering. When they saw Jalen emerge, some stood up, unsure. One stepped forward, a mere.
"You okay, Mr. Pierce?"
Jalen looked at them all. The hallway, the school, the wait. "Not yet," he said. "But we're getting there." He turned the corner, his footsteps echoing with clarity, not of closure, but of ignition. And as he stepped out into the cold air, his phone buzzed. It was a notification. The video of Carlisle mocking him had just reached 1 million views. And trending alongside it, a new hashtag, "Numbers Never Lie, Jalen declines." And then files an official lawsuit under the Civil Rights Act. The courtroom didn't smell like justice. It smelled like varnished wood, recycled air, and the kind of silence that held tightly onto the walls. Jalen sat at the plaintiff's table, in a charcoal gray suit, fingers laced, quiet storm beneath a calm surface. He wasn't nervous, not anymore. He was resolved. This wasn't about vindication. It was about exposure. The moment Oxford's board had offered him a 6-month severance and a non-disclosure agreement, he understood exactly what they feared most. It wasn't scandal. It was math, numbers, truth they couldn't dispute. They wanted silence. He brought them data. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Word had spread. Students were seated along the back rows. Former faculty whispered in the aisles. Local press jostled for seats. Even a few Oxford alumni had shown up, some visibly curious, others carrying a guilt they hadn't named yet. The defense team looked polished and performative. Crisp suits, legal pads, perfect posture. Beside them, Carlisle Whitmore sat, not in a witness chair but close enough to feel the weight of what was coming. His face was unreadable, but his fingers tapped, not on rhythm, on instinct. The judge entered. A seasoned black woman, with sharp eyes, that sliced through pretense. Her presence alone grounded the room. She wasted no time. The trial opened, and Jalen's attorney, an unshakable civil rights litigator with ice in her tone, began her opening with precision. She didn't dramatize. She calculated. She guided the jury through Jalen's journey piece by piece, beginning with the mocking faculty email, then the student video, the performance data, the salary breakdowns, and finally, the digital forensics. When she presented the Oxford pattern, the spreadsheet that Jalen had meticulously compiled, showing 20 years of racial disparities, the room shifted. Gasps were stifled. Jurors leaned in. The data wasn't anecdotal. It was structural. It proved what had long been felt, but never quantified, that black faculty were consistently paid less, promoted slower, evaluated more harshly, and recognized less often, even when they outperformed their white counterparts. Then came the visual evidence. A grainy video from 2008, played on the overhead screen. A student on stage mimicking a black teacher's mannerisms. Stiff arms, exaggerated voice, wearing a crimson blazer. Laughter echoed in the footage, and in the corner of the frame stood Carlisle, arms folded, smiling. The parody wasn't harmless, it was targeted. And now, documented. The defense scrambled, claiming context, performance, artistic freedom. But the judge allowed it. "This isn't just admissible," she said. "It's necessary." Then came the testimonies. Tessa Langford took the stand first. Her voice was steady, youthful, but deliberate. She told the court how she'd witnessed Carlisle direct students to mock Jalen during rehearsals, how the line "some people are good at numbers" wasn't a joke, it was a message. She spoke not from outrage, but from responsibility. "It felt like we were told to laugh at someone just for existing," she said, "and I recorded it because I didn't know how else to stop it." Then Miss Renly from the English department. She admitted, under oath, that she had witnessed Carlisle belittle Jalen's methods in meetings, that she'd remained silent, that she'd laughed too. Her voice cracked, not because she was nervous, but because she was ashamed. And finally, Dr. Lorna Miles. She entered the courtroom in the same crimson blazer that had once marked her as the butt of a cruel skit. She took the stand, looked straight ahead, and spoke with quiet, anchored power. She recounted how her ideas were praised in private and mocked in public, how Carlisle orchestrated satire at her expense, how the administration let it happen, how one day, without warning, her job title was eliminated and she was reassigned to a rural school district with no explanation and no appeal. Her final words on the stand were clear. Oxford didn't just erase my job, it tried to erase my name. Carlisle sat frozen. His confident mask didn't crack, but it tightened. Then it was his turn. Called to the stand, Carlisle was poised, smooth, and seemingly unfazed. At first, he described his work as transformative, his productions as inclusive, and the video as misinterpreted. But Jalen's attorney, unshaken, produced metadata logs, time-stamped edits, a digital trail proving Carlisle had altered lesson files after accessing Jalen's teaching materials. She presented documents that showed Carlisle submitted backdated entries to appear as the originator of work that wasn't his. The room held its breath. Under cross-examination, Carlisle stammered. Not much, but enough. For the first time, his voice hesitated. His explanations cracked. He looked not at the jury but at the floor. That moment, quiet and devastating, did more damage than any outburst ever could. The jury watched as the man once revered as Oxford's golden educator began to crumble, not from accusation, but from exposure. The final words from Jalen's attorney were simple. This isn't a case of hurt feelings or misunderstood creativity. It's theft of credit, of dignity, of opportunity. It's racism, with a polished accent and administrative approval. And now, the numbers tell the story. The defense had no redirect. As the judge prepared to close proceedings, her eyes swept the courtroom. This court will recess for deliberation, she said, then paused. But I will say this. What's been presented here goes beyond this trial. The evidence suggests a systemic pattern of inequity within Oxford's academic structure. I believe this court must consider whether further investigation is warranted. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The media took note. Carlisle looked pale. And Jalen? He finally exhaled. Not because the fight was over, but because for the first time, someone in power had spoken what the system had tried for years to silence. The judge announces deliberation, but hints at a systemic investigation into the school. The courthouse steps were quiet the morning the verdict was scheduled. Reporters stood clustered in anticipation, mics clipped to lapels, camera crews pacing in arcs like sharks tracing a wound in the water. A few students from Oxford waited behind barricades, black armbands wrapped around their sleeves. Some held printed quotes from Jalen's court testimony. Others simply waited in silence, eyes fixed on the glass doors. Inside, the air vibrated with tension. The jury had been deliberating for just under 6 hours when the bailiff returned to the courtroom. There was no whispering, no stalling, just a quiet nod to the judge and a signal for everyone to rise. Jalen didn't move immediately. He sat for a breath longer, gathering everything, his past, his father's legacy, the spreadsheet, the scars that weren't physical but still ached. He adjusted his tie, then stood. The jury filed in. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman, with unreadable eyes, passed the envelope to the judge, who scanned it, then returned it without expression. She looked toward the courtroom. In the matter of Pierce versus Oxford Preparatory Academy, she began, we, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff. Gasps. Audible, sharp, electric. Jalen didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. Not until the rest followed. The court orders Oxford Preparatory Academy to pay damages in the amount of $2.1 million for discrimination, emotional distress, and professional sabotage. Furthermore, the court mandates that Oxford issue a public written apology and agree to a third-party federal oversight committee to monitor its hiring and evaluation practices for the next 5 years. Carlisle, seated quietly in the back row, exhaled as if someone had just cut the lights on a stage mid-performance. But it wasn't over. The judge paused, then spoke again. While this case is closed in judgment, the broader implications are not. I will be referring these findings to the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education for formal inquiry. The patterns presented here suggest institutional inequity beyond this individual case. No one in the room moved. The silence wasn't shock. It was reckoning. Carlyle left the courthouse through a side door. There were no statements, no cameras, no students waiting. Just a resignation email that hit Oxford's administrative inbox 3 hours later. No subject line, no farewell message. Just 2 words. Effective immediately. His name was removed from the school's website by midnight. But the aftershock extended far beyond Oxford. Within days, education blogs, legal journals, and national news headlines circled the verdict. They didn't just report the ruling, they examined the data. Jalen's spreadsheet. The Oxford pattern was published in a national magazine's investigative feature titled Excellence Denied. Black educators across the country began referencing the case. At a university in Chicago, a professor opened his lecture by saying, "We owe Jalen Pierce. Because today someone proved what we've been screaming in silence." Within a week, a think tank requested permission to replicate Jalen's analysis model across multiple districts. Within a month, 3 other educators filed similar lawsuits. And Oxford? Its upcoming donor gala was cancelled. Its enrollment dropped. Parents demanded transparency. The school board issued a carefully worded apology, crafted by attorneys and signed without emotion. But it was too late. The damage was not just reputational. It was systemic. The curtain had been pulled back. Jalen declined most interviews. He spoke once at a small community event held by local students, where he said simply, "Truth should not be brave, but in this system it has to be." Then, 1 week later, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a voicemail, a sealed envelope, hand-delivered by a courier. It bore the seal of the U.S. Department of Education. Inside was a formal job offer. The position: Senior Advisor for Equity Analytics and Bias Reform. It was prestigious, national in scope, a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The job came with a research team, access to federal education data, and the authority to influence policy at the district level across all 50 states. But there was a condition. If accepted, Jalen would be required to withdraw any additional pending claims against Oxford, including the newly uncovered salary manipulation files. He would also be required to sign a clause limiting public commentary on the Oxford case for the duration of his federal appointment. He sat with the letter for hours. This was the very system that had tried to silence him, now asking him to lead reform, so long as he didn't speak too loudly about what got him there. It was power. And a muzzle. Simultaneously, he thought about his students, the ones still walking Oxford's halls, the faculty members too scared to speak, the emails he'd received from teachers across the country saying, "Thank you. I didn't know we were allowed to fight back." He looked at the final line of the offer letter. "We believe your work represents a turning point for equitable education." But Jalen knew better. Turning points didn't just happen. They were made. And the cost was never simple. He folded the letter, placed it beside his father's algorithm, and turned toward the window. Outside, the sky was heavy with autumn rain, but somewhere in the distance he heard young voices chanting again, this time not in protest, but in purpose. The system was still breathing. But so was the truth. Jalen receives a job offer from the Department of Education, but it comes with a big condition. The Department of Education's letter sat on Jalen's desk like an unopened door, promising elevation, but casting a long, complex shadow. The embossed seal gleamed under the light, but the content within was far from polished glory. They wanted him, not just as a consultant or a figurehead, but as the face of a new national initiative, Senior Advisor for Equity Analytics and Bias Reform. It was a position that would give him power to shape anti-bias curriculum across thousands of school districts. He would lead national audits, inform textbook standards, train administrators, and build tools to identify discrimination before it burrowed deep into policy. It was everything the system had once denied his father, everything his own classroom walls couldn't contain. But it came with a condition, one clause buried beneath the celebration. He would have to withdraw his second pending lawsuit, one against Oxford's district superintendent, the one that named names, traced signatures, and documented how pay gaps were authorized, how policies were edited quietly to favor certain staff, how entire departments were manipulated to suppress black advancement. They weren't asking him to walk away from his past. They were demanding he turn his back on the truth that launched his future. Jalen knew this wasn't just a legal request. It was a message. If you want the seat, stop flipping the table. He stood at the window of his apartment, watching distant traffic smear against the wet pavement. His mind drifted to Elias Pierce, his father, who once said, "They'll let you change the rules, son, as long as you don't ask who wrote them." Jalen had uncovered not just a broken system, but the fingerprints of the very architects who were now calling for reform. The department's letter praised his courage, called him a changemaker, a voice the country needed, but all that praise was paper-thin compared to the weight of what he was being asked to sacrifice. Personal justice, the superintendent's exposure, the precedent that could inspire 100 more educators to come forward. He opened his laptop and pulled up the second case folder. Inside, the proof was chilling. Authorization chains showing the superintendent had repeatedly overridden committee evaluations to suppress Jalen's salary. Emails discussing optics and perception management related to black hires. One memo flatly stated, "He's drawing too much attention to himself. This is not a good look for us right now." Jalen closed the file, sat back, and listened to the storm inside him. If he walked away now, the lawsuit would be sealed, buried, forgotten by everyone except the teachers, still living the damage. But if he declined the position, would anything change? Would he just be another educator made an example of, praised for resistance, punished for persistence? The next morning, he met with the department representative, Allison Grant. She was sharp, composed, sympathetic. She assured him the role came with real authority. You'd be guiding national reform, not just talking about change, enforcing it. But when Jalen asked her directly about the clause, her tone softened. "It's about optics," she admitted. "You can't lead federal oversight if you're still in open litigation with the school system. It becomes a conflict." He pressed her. "But if that lawsuit exposes more of what you're asking me to fix, shouldn't it be part of the process?" Allison looked at him, hesitated, then gave the most honest answer she could. "That's not how it works." Back at home, he sat again at his desk, surrounded by silence. The letter, the lawsuit, his father's algorithm pinned to the corkboard above his head. He thought about Dr. Miles, about the student protests, about Tessa standing on the auditorium steps reading lines from the intercom poems. He thought about the other emails he'd received, anonymous ones from teachers in other districts who had started running their own numbers, asking him for templates, afraid to speak but desperate to measure the quiet injustice around them. They saw him not as a hero but as proof that the system could be challenged with logic, not just slogans. He took a deep breath. Then slowly, he signed the letter, accepted the role. He would take the position, not because he trusted the system, but because he no longer needed to. He had already learned how to outcalculate it. The press release went live. 48 hours later, national media picked it up instantly. Jalen Pierce appointed to lead federal equity reform in education. News anchors called it a landmark moment. Opinion pieces praised his transition from courtroom warrior to policy architect. Social media exploded with both celebration and criticism. Some hailed him as the future of public education. Others accused him of selling out. "You can't fix a system from inside a cage," one activist tweeted. But Jalen said nothing. Because what the public didn't know was that he hadn't truly surrendered the case. Hours before signing the federal agreement, he took one last action. He opened an encrypted server, uploaded every file from the second lawsuit, salary manipulation, altered evaluations, digital audit trails, and submitted it to an award-winning investigative journalist, known for dismantling educational cover-ups. No name, no contact, just a single typed sentence. "If justice can't be pursued in court, let it be pursued in the light." The story, he knew, would take weeks to verify, but it would break, and when it did, it wouldn't be tied to him. The facts would speak, the numbers would scream. He didn't want the glory, he wanted the blueprint changed. That evening, he walked through the city with his phone turned off, hands in pockets. Rain misted down, soft and cleansing. Somewhere a street musician played a trumpet, that didn't quite reach the right notes, but didn't need to. He thought about redemption, about revenge, about the ways both wore disguises. For some, redemption came with applause. For others, it came with scars that never got stitched. And for people like Jalen, maybe it wasn't about choosing one over the other. Maybe it was about holding both in balance, teaching one system to correct, while exposing another. He returned home, placed the signed offer letter in a drawer beside his father's unopened pocket journal. The one Elias had always carried, but never filled. The journal was blank, untouched, until now. Jalen opened it. On the first page, In neat handwriting, he wrote, "They offered me a seat. I brought my own table." Jalen agrees to the position, but secretly files an anonymous whistleblower report to the press. The world didn't change overnight, but the way it measured change did. Months after stepping into his new role at the Department of Education, Jalen Pierce had become something more than a federal advisor. He had become a movement. The courtroom headlines had faded, but his message echoed louder than ever, through forums, policy drafts, and a groundbreaking online course that no one saw coming. Titled The Math of Injustice, it was initially a quiet passion project, just a few recorded lectures, but it erupted into a national phenomenon. The first video opened not with legal jargon or dramatic music, but with numbers. Jalen sat before a simple chalkboard and asked one question: what does inequality look like on paper? From there, he walked viewers through real-life data, school evaluation matrices, hiring bias patterns, internal ranking systems, dressed as meritocracy. But it wasn't dry, it was intimate. Jalen narrated every example like it had a heartbeat. He spoke of the students who were never recommended for advanced classes, the teachers passed over in silence. He laid out each system as if it were a rigged game, and then showed exactly how it had been rigged. The reaction was immediate. Students shared the link across social media, tagging their own schools. Teachers began using it in staff meetings. District officials, many of whom had previously ignored Jalen's warnings, requested full access to the course. Within 3 months, over 1.2 million users had enrolled. Universities added it to their education curriculum. Several states moved to make it mandatory for new teacher certification. But Jalen didn't measure the course's success in enrollment stats. He measured it by the messages. They came by the hundreds. Teachers who realized the systems they'd trusted were infected with quiet prejudice. Students who wrote, "I finally understand why I was always told to be quiet in class." One letter came from a former Oxford student, a boy who had once ridiculed Jalen's lesson plans. He wrote, "I laughed at you back then, because I thought being accepted meant copying the people in power. But you were the only one showing us how to lead. I just didn't see it." Some letters came handwritten, others through email. One message stood out more than the rest. It simply read, "Thank you for turning equations into empathy." In his new office overlooking the Washington skyline, Jalen kept only one framed item on the wall: his father's letter, preserved behind glass. It was the last message Elias Pierce had ever written. Below it, on a small brass plate, Jalen had engraved the words, "Stand taller than the silence they give you." The office was clean, minimalist, functional, just the way Jalen liked it. From here, he reviewed district reports, audited bias patterns, and drafted policies for anti-discrimination metrics. He met with state officials and teacher unions. He designed tools to measure harm, not through outrage, but through math. He no longer asked the system to change. He designed systems that couldn't avoid it. But Jalen understood something most people didn't. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a formula. Solving one equation always revealed another. Change was recursive. Oppression was adaptive. It was a quiet Friday evening when it happened. The office was empty. The city buzzed below, muffled by the window's glass. Jalen was finishing a policy draft on equitable STEM access when his computer pinged one new email. No subject, no sender ID, just an attachment. The file name was precise, clean, and chilling. "The next pattern you must uncover." Jalen's heart stilled. He clicked the file. It opened like a whisper. Rows and columns filled the screen. National teacher certification data, charter school hiring stats, standardized student outcomes. On the surface, it looked like any other data set. But something felt off. He scrolled. A single cell in row 2074 was highlighted in yellow. It read, "Look at who gets hired and who doesn't. Same test scores, same credentials, different skin, no traceable sender, no IP path, just the truth." For a long moment, Jalen didn't move. His fingers hovered over the keys. Outside, the skyline pulsed. Then slowly, methodically, he opened a new folder, a blank document. At the top, he typed a new title: Equation 2 Bias in Certification. Because numbers never lied. And history was rewritten. Not through rage alone, but by truth that refused to stay buried. Jalen wasn't done. He was just beginning. The final scene, Jalen receives an anonymous message with a new data file. Title: The Next Pattern You Must Uncover. If you've ever been silenced for speaking the truth, if you've watched someone be punished for doing the right thing, then you already know this story isn't fiction. It's the mirror we try to look away from. But silence protects no one. Type yes if you believe in justice and subscribe if this broke your heart.